everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. It really is a pleasure to be here. CASIP, I think, is one of the real models of collaboration. It's not often that individual agencies who do such really important work independently see the need and the benefit of working together and collaborating together rather than competing with each other. And the establishment of CASIP and now this group of boards working together is really quite special. And you should feel quite special because it doesn't happen that readily or that easily or that often. And it's hard work to work collaboratively, particularly in the environment in which we live today, where it seems that competition rather than collaboration is encouraged. So congratulations to you all for the work that you do. I'm going to, as you see on the slide today, talk a little bit about a report that I wrote, now it seems like a long time ago, on all the changes to immigration policy, but they keep on changing, so I keep on updating, and I really want to bring it home in terms of not just the changes to immigration policy, but the changes in labor market policy, because obviously the work that you do is really the intersection of immigration policy, labor market policy, and labor market programs for immigrants and the integration of immigrants into the labor market. So, here we go, it works. I'm going to start off a little bit with the pace and scope of the change and then go through some of the policy and program changes, then bring it home, I hope, to you in terms of implications for the members of your organizations, and then identify some possible areas for collaborative discussion, and those might be some topics that you choose to talk about later on this evening in your small groups, or not. But these are some suggestions that I'm putting forward for you. In terms of the pace and scope of change, I've been involved in the immigration business professionally since the late 70s. That's a long time. And I have never, ever seen the pace and scope of change that we have seen in the past few years. It really is quite breathtaking. And there is no sign of it stopping. It just keeps on coming. And I do an exercise with my students at Queen's where they have to review the media for a week and identify a particular immigration issue that they think is important enough to brief the minister on. And at the beginning of the first class, the students say, every week? There's not going to be an immigration issue to brief the minister on every week. And I say, well, just you wait. And then the debate as time goes on during the course is, which one do we brief him on? There's so many happening. So it really is quite astonishing. The changes that have been introduced affect absolutely every aspect of immigration policy and immigration programs. It has affected the process for immigration reform. It has affected the powers and roles of the various players in the immigration system. And I believe that the discourse on immigration has really changed, and not necessarily for the better. In addition to that, we have, for the first time, an Ontario immigration strategy, and for the first time, a bill that has been tabled in the legislature in Ontario so that Ontario will be the second province to have immigration legislation, only the second. Quebec is the first. So it is quite an interesting development. There have been changes that have been proposed, some implemented, some still in the being negotiated, even though we may have an agreement across the country in terms of some of the most recent changes on the Canadian Jobs Grant. There will still be bilateral discussions on a federal-provincial basis across the country to put flesh on those bones. But in combination, all these changes, I believe, have a huge potential individual impact, each of these changes on their own, and certainly cumulatively a very significant impact. And the impact is going to be felt, or is already being felt, not only by individuals and their families, not only in terms of community organizations like your own that have to adapt to all these changes, but I believe it will also have an impact on Canada's ability to attract and retain immigrants. And I also believe that these changes will have a fundamental impact on our society at large. I'm going to go through some of the, not all of these, don't worry, it would take me too long and we don't have the time. But this is just a schema that shows you the sort of the breadth and range of the federal immigration changes. The top tier, across the top, are all the permanent classes to Canada, of immigrants to Canada, the refugee class, the economic class, and the family class. At 3 o'clock, you see temporary entrants, which include the temporary foreign workers and international students and visitors. At 9 o'clock, you see the changes to the Citizenship Act, which are making some have already been implemented and some are making their way through the Parliament now. And then down on the lower quadrant, you see the changes affecting services, changes affecting public engagement, consultation process, the democratic process, public discourse, and in the far right at, 4 o'clock, I guess, the powers and roles. Today, I am really only going to talk about those elements that I think are directly related to your particular agencies. And I'm going to be speaking specifically about the economic class, which is at 12 o'clock, temporary entrance at 3 o'clock, a little bit about powers and roles, a little bit about settlement services. And I'm falling absolutely into the trap that has been established by the federal government by announcing bit by bit, piece by piece, without looking at the interrelationships between all these various pieces and the cumulative impact of all these various pieces. So for example, I'm going to do what I said I wasn't going to do. If you look at some of the changes in terms of the family class, I believe that that will have an impact on the economic class. Because if people are considering what country they're going to go to, if they believe that they will not be able to be reunited with their parents or grandparents easily, they may choose not to come to Canada and may choose to go to another country. So all of these changes are interrelated, but we just don't have time tonight for me to go through all of them. Citizenship, we could spend a whole night talking just about the proposed bill that is before Parliament now and its potential long-term impact. But we're not going to go there unless you ask me a question during the question period or catch me at coffee. So, in terms of the overall change of directions, I think we can summarize them in this way. With all these changes, there are tighter requirements for permanent entry of all classes. It's harder to get accepted as a permanent resident to Canada now, whether in the economic class or the family class or the refugee class. On the other hand, there's been a real facilitation to allow for the temporary entry of people, whether as temporary foreign workers or as international students. The temporary foreign worker piece we're going to talk a little bit more about because I think that is actually quite relevant to the work that you do. And that the government has sort of blown hot and cold on that, and it's under review, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Certainly there are more opportunities now than there were before for people who come here initially as temporary entrants to transition to permanent residence, but it's only for some temporary residents, not all. And there are some issues there too, but generally high-skilled temporary foreign workers have the capacity to transition to permanent residency, and some international students are eligible for transition. But in both those cases, we are getting more and more into what I call a two-step immigration process, where people first come here with temporary status, which involves sub-precarity because they don't know that they can, in fact, stay. They're not eligible for services, et cetera, before they can then transition to permanent residency. There are certainly tougher rules for citizenship, and they will get tougher if this bill becomes law, determining who is eligible, the criteria people have to meet, and the proof that people have to provide to indicate that they have met those criteria. And for the first time, the possibility of ministerial authority to revoke citizenship without significant due process and without significant appeal process. So for the first time, we have in legislation, if this act goes through, a difference or two-tiered citizenship, which we never had, or we did have a long time ago, but recently we have not had. There was no difference before if you were a naturalized citizen or a Canadian-born citizen in terms of your rights and obligations. There was no difference if you were a dual citizen or a citizen only of Canada. That will change with this piece of legislation. And there have been real changing powers and roles, much more centralization in the powers of the minister, away from Parliament and away from provinces, and much more use of third parties. And the third parties are particularly in the selection process, but in other areas as well, involving employers and involving educational institutions and involving third-party assessors to determine whether people in fact meet the requirements for entry into Canada. There's a real mix in terms of these policy and programmatic changes. Some seem very positive on the surface. For example, some of the new selection criteria for federal skilled workers, with a focus on human capital, language, and education in particular. A new trades program was introduced, which I think is a good thing. But we don't really know yet, in terms of the implementation, whether these changes will have the outcomes that are intended or will have unintended potential negative consequences. And I'll go through some of those in a moment. Others of these changes are actually quite problematic. And one of them is a significant increase in low-skilled temporary foreign workers. In 2003, there were 2,327 low-skilled temporary foreign workers admitted to Canada. In 2012, there were 20,636, a huge increase in those low-skilled temporary foreign workers. Some of the changes have, in fact, been evidence-based, like the need for increased language requirements, not only for federal skilled workers, but for the provincial nominee programs. But for others, I would argue there is no evidentiary base at all, like for some of the citizenship changes. And we can talk about that later on. Others, in fact, seem counter to the evidence. For example, we all know that there is nothing temporary about temporary workers. We know that from the European experience. We know that from the guest workers. We know that from temporary workers in the United States. Yet we don't seem to have taken that into account in some of the changes that have been introduced. So, as I said, today we're talking about economic immigrants, and I'm going to go through those, temporary entrance and transition to permanent residency, and the changing roles and the implications for the members of your organizations. So let's start with the federal skilled workers. The selection criteria changes. First of all, for the first time since IRPA, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which was introduced in 2002, The government decided that there would be an additional occupational screen before individuals could be assessed on their human capital. And that occupational screen has now been restricted to only 24 occupations, primarily in the engineering fields and health-related occupations. If an individual applying to Canada as a federal skilled worker does not have experience in any of those 24 occupations, they cannot apply for immigration to Canada, even if they might have enormous human capital that would allow them to adapt to a variety of different occupations. A rigorous language standard was introduced, which is, for those familiar with Canadian language benchmarks, it's a CLB 7 level. That's a fairly significant level of language knowledge, and it has to be achieved in all 4 areas: speaking, hearing, reading, and writing. There is a third-party assessment of people's language capacity, which certainly brings objectivity to the exercise, and a third-party assessment of academic credentials, which I will get to in a moment, that should provide objectivity as well. More points are allotted for younger age. So if you are between the ages of 18 and 35, you get the maximum points for entry to Canada. If you're over the age of 47, how many here in the room are over the age of 47? There would be a significant decline in terms of the points allocated once you reach that very elderly age. And a separate stream for trades was introduced, and the government has announced a brand new model for selection to Canada called the Expression of Interest model, which will be in place in early 2015, they say. So what are some concerns about these changes? It'll be harder to qualify, and it has already become harder to qualify for entry to Canada as a skilled worker. But there likely will be better short-term results for those that are selected because of that human capital level. The occupation list is really problematic. We have an economy that is certainly based on more than 24 occupations. And restricting entry only to 24 occupations, in my mind, is incredibly short-sighted in terms of, and most of them are engineering and health professions, which means they still have to go through all the licensing hoops with regulatory bodies before they can even practice in those occupations for which they were selected. The emphasis on language, education, and age are all supported by evaluation. Younger people do better, people with more education do better, people with knowledge of either English or French do better. However, the language standards in place, CLB 7, is going to change source countries to Canada. That's been proven to be the case in Australia and New Zealand. Think about China, which has been one of the top 3 sources of immigration to Canada for many, many years now. Many people from China will not qualify. Think at the same time about Canada's interest in terms of trade relations with China. Think at the same time about how well Chinese immigrants have done in this country, and even more importantly, how well their children have done in terms of integration. So does it make sense, potentially, to cut off or reduce the possibility of people from China coming to the country when they are as successful as they have been? The third-party assessment of education credentials, as I said, I think will bring objectivity. But on the other hand, it will certainly raise expectations on the part of the immigrant coming in. They will think that if they are now required to have their academic credentials assessed by a designated body, designated by the Government of Canada to do that assessment, and they are getting points for immigration on the basis of their assessment, wouldn't you think that those academic credentials are therefore going to be recognized in Canada by both educational institutions, by licensing bodies, and by employers? Not necessarily. So that is still a significant problem. Youth is definitely a predictor of success, as I said, but we know how much difficulty young people here in Canada, whether they are Canadian born or whether they are immigrants to Canada, are having in terms of the labor market, and they are competing with other new entrants. So that will be somewhat problematic. And applicants over the age of 47 may in fact be in their prime in terms of their potential labor market contributions, and they are having or bringing with them children. And we should be thinking about our immigration programs not just for the first generation, but also for the children and the 1.5 generation and the second generation. The new trade stream was an excellent idea, very badly designed. And the way that has been implemented to date, we have very few people actually meeting the criteria and meeting the qualifications to come into the country as skilled tradespeople, which we know is a real need in the country. But I won't go into the details, but the criteria make it pretty well impossible for someone to come into Canada selected on a permanent basis. They generally will have to come in first again as a temporary foreign worker and then apply from within Canada after they have been lucky enough to find an employer to provide them with an apprenticeship or help them to be certified. And we know how difficult it is already to find employers to provide that kind of training opportunity. All the changes that I've talked about are really, with the exception of the trades, are really in terms of the federal skilled worker principal applicants. When people think about immigration to Canada, everybody says, oh, you have this wonderful point system. And this is what all these revisions I'm talking about are the point system. The point system only applies to principal applicants of the federal skilled worker program. Take a gander. What percentage of the flow, the total flow of immigration to Canada, is comprised by principal applicants of the federal skilled worker program?
30%?
Guess again, lower.
5, 10.
Well, okay, I'll tell you. It's going down. That's the other thing that's so interesting. The number of federal skilled workers who do the best, based on all evaluations, they do the best in terms of labor market integration, income, economic participation. In 2005, we accepted 52,269 federal skilled workers to the program, which comprised principal applicants, which comprised, whoever said 30 was right for 2005, 29% of the flow were principal applicants of federal skilled workers. By 2012, that number went down. Even though the number of immigrants went up, that number went down to 38,601 and comprised only 18% of the total flow of immigration to Canada. So the point system that we've spent so much time fixing only deals with 18% of the flow to Canada. So the government is introducing something that they are borrowing and adapting from New Zealand and Australia called the expression of interest model. It's a two-step application process, which means that people first indicate their interest to come to Canada, and they have to meet certain basic criteria that will likely be similar to the federal skilled worker criteria. They get into a pool, and then that pool is reviewed by the federal government, provincial governments. We don't know if and how employers will have access to the pool, likely not direct access to the pool. If anybody says, I like that individual, then that individual is invited to formally apply for immigration to Canada. If no one identifies that individual as someone of interest, their application is returned after a very short period of time in that pool. And we don't know yet whether it's going to be 3 months or 6 months, but it's going to be a short period of time. That window will be a short period of time. It will certainly deal with the inventory and backlog problem, because there will not be an inventory or backlog problem. We don't know if it's going to be used just for federal skilled workers and federal skilled tradespeople, or whether it will go beyond that, how it will be implemented alongside with a continued provincial nominee program. We do not know whether temporary foreign workers are ultimately going to be part of that pool. There are many, many operational questions still afoot, but we know that the federal government is actively thinking about using the job bank as a way to have employers have access to people applying for immigration to Canada. From my discussions with employers, they're not terribly happy about that. We don't know how the provincial nominee programs are going to work alongside the expression of interest system. The business class has basically been eliminated. You may have read about that. People can no longer come to Canada as investors or entrepreneurs. There's just a very small startup program that has been introduced. Temporary foreign workers is a huge issue, and this I do want to spend a little bit of time on. Lots of problems with the temporary foreign worker program. It is a misnomer to call it a program. It is a composite of many different programs, high-end and low-end. It's completely demand-driven. There are no targets. There are no caps. Employers request only a certain number have to actually get a labor market opinion from the Government of Canada before they can bring people in, and the numbers are going up astronomically, as are the length of stays. In 2012, there were 338,221 temporary foreign workers in Canada. Did you hear that? It's a very, very big number. And it is more than immigrants admitted to Canada. More temporary foreign workers than immigrants. The low-skilled pilot, despite all the evidence, is also still increasing. And there is no transition to permanent residency allowed for the low-skilled temporary foreign workers. Although new protections have been announced, there is very little enforcement of those new regulations to ensure that commitments are being honored. And at the low, or even at the low end, for all temporary foreign workers, there is a 4-year limit for people to be in the country. At the end of that 4 years, the first 4-year period is coming up April 1st, 2015, and people are quite worried about what's going to happen the day after when people don't leave. And are we going to have a large undocumented workforce in Canada, which was the result in Europe and was the result in the United States? There is, however, no 4-year limit for employers. So employers can just bring in another group for 4 years, if they so desire, with no requirement for them to invest in training or invest in infrastructure or to look at their wages or working conditions or to look at underemployed people or unemployed people or underrepresented people in the workforce. And none of these temporary foreign workers are eligible for federally funded services. So it is quite problematic. International students, another big group that is growing. International students are seen not only as useful to us in terms of enriching the life on campus and bringing their interests and their expertise to other students, not only because they provide work in labs and on campus, graduate, teaching assistants, that kind of thing. Not only because they pay differential tuition, not only because they spend money in their local communities, but equally importantly now, because they are really seen as a pool of potential immigrants who are educated in Canada and who speak one of our official languages. So there are real efforts now to both attract and retain international students, and one of the real perks that was introduced was to allow them to work off campus, not just on campus, and to work for 3 years after they have graduated. They are not eligible for any services, though, from the federal government, and it is not a requirement of the institutions that bring them in to use any of that differential tuition to really provide services to them. Some universities and colleges do well, others not so well. And institutions are required to monitor them now more than they were in past. The Canadian Experience class, again, this is the class that allows people to transition from temporary to permanent status. There has been a tightening of eligible occupations and caps per occupation. It's forming a growing proportion of the economic class, where two-step immigration is now seen as a positive thing by the federal government. But again, my view is that it's better to bring people in as permanent residents with full rights, full access to services, full responsibilities right from the outset, rather than that two-staged process. I'm really not going to go through the changing powers except for number 3, and that's where I think we do have to have a conversation about the role of employers, the role of educational institutions, who are now selecting more and more the people that will ultimately become permanent residents and citizens of our country, but there's no concomitant responsibility on their behalf to help these individuals actually settle and integrate, or to recognize or to certify them. Okay, so that's all on the immigration side. On the labor market side, we know that the LMDA, the Labor Market Development Agreements, where the federal government provides funding to the provinces to provide labor market training for EI-eligible people, is coming up for renewal fairly soon. And if the LMA model is the precedent, there may be difficulties in terms of those negotiations coming up in terms of the LMDA. The LMA are the labor market agreements for non-EI eligible people. That's what you have read about in the newspapers, where Minister Kenny is in negotiation with the provinces. They have clawed back money from the LMAs that they initially had given to the provinces, but they are now negotiating about whether the provinces, and I think they have agreed now, that the provinces can use some of the LMD money or their own money to be the provincial contribution to this new initiative. It's still less money, but there may be more flexibility as to which pot the provinces can use to put forward their share for the new Canadian Jobs Grant. Employment Ontario will be affected by these changes, and we don't know exactly how. Employment Ontario is a big funder of your organizations, and that will have an impact. With the LMA, the provinces said one of the reasons they were opposed to the Canadian Jobs Grant was because the funds that went for the LMA for non-EI eligible people, primarily for vulnerable populations like immigrants, would be affected, and they wanted to make sure that vulnerable people like immigrants would in fact get the money that was due them. Let's be sure and let's be vigilant to ensure that the provinces actually don't forget immigrants when they now have negotiated more flexibility. Provinces have not been hugely willing to have targeted envelopes for particular population groups like immigrants. In Ontario, the bridging programs are really only the only program that's really targeted exclusively to immigrants. All the other programs are for everybody, and immigrants are part of the everybody. So what are the implications? The increased language standards. Everybody seems to think, oh, everybody's going to be coming over speaking English and French. Remember, it's only 18% of the flow that's going to have to meet these. They are still going to be coming in with their spouses and dependent children. Family class is still going to be coming in. Refugee class is still going to be coming in, all wanting to participate in the labor market. So don't assume that everybody is now going to be at a higher level of language. But they will be coming from different source countries at 18%. So think about what that means in terms of your programming. Some countries, or some immigrants in some countries who are not English or French speaking, may smell the coffee and say, we better learn the language if we want to come. There's a real opportunity for overseas language training. Real opportunity in some of our current source countries that may be negatively affected. The credential assessment pre-application, I think counseling is going to change for a lot of you guys because people are going to be even more incensed because their expectations will have been raised. And to explain to them that that was just for immigration purposes and not for employment purposes and not for educational purposes and not for licensure purposes is not going to go over really well. Colleges, are you going to be accepting the assessments made by some of these academic credential assessment services and giving people advanced standing or whatever? Or do you want to consider potentially becoming an assessor so that you can have some impact on that? The trade stream, it's a mess, but we need tradespeople. What can we do in order to help that process for people who may be coming in as temporary foreign workers that want to transition? What can we do with employers to potentially get them to provide apprenticeships and opportunities for certification for those coming in as immigrants? What role do colleges want to play in that? International students, what about supports and services to international students who have work permits, who are eligible to work? What kind of supports and services do your agencies potentially want to provide to them that will ease them, not only in the labor market, but ease them to transition for permanent residency, if that's a growing number of who the pool is for permanent residency? Similarly with temporary foreign workers. They're not eligible for federally funded services, but they are a hugely growing population, and many of them will transition, should we be providing supports and services to them. With the EOI, the expression of interest, are there things that we can do with employers early on in the game to assist them before they go the EOI route? To say, have you thought about this whole crew of people that we have in our agencies that are unemployed or underemployed, that have the specific skills that you're going to go abroad to look for? What about, how can we help you? And generally with employer interaction, with the training, with apprenticeships, and with alternatives to them using the temporary foreign worker program. What about the people that you are serving your agencies, working with employers to match them up with people already here or underemployed, underrepresented, whatever, rather than going the TFW route? Should we have more of a pre-arrival focus? Federal government, you heard about the CIP, but more and more of federal resources are going towards overseas interventions. Should we start looking much more significantly about what we could do while people are still overseas rather than waiting for them once they arrive here? We no longer have an investor and entrepreneur program coming into Canada, but we know that many immigrants here are incredibly entrepreneurial and incredibly interested in establishing small businesses. And they may have to become more and more entrepreneurial if the labor market isn't opening up for them. Should our agencies be looking at helping people become entrepreneurs and small business owners, providing them with the training, with the assistance they need to make that transition? And what should we be doing collaboratively in terms of monitoring all these changes and the impact on people in our agencies, doing the research, doing the analysis that we need to do, and doing the advocacy to ensure that while these changes are going on in terms of the Canadian Jobs Grant and the changes to Employment Ontario, how can we ensure that immigrants are not left behind? And in the design of the programs, which that hasn't happened yet, how can we potentially influence the design of that program to ensure that immigrants are well served? So here are possible areas, and this is my last. Here are possible areas for collaborative discussions that you may want to pick up on tonight or later, or maybe not at all. In terms of clients, should we think about expanding who we actually are serving? Should we look at international students? Should we look at temporary foreign workers? Should we have more of a focus on tradespeople than we have in past? In terms of services, should we be looking at preparing potentially people for self-employment, entrepreneurship, small business ownership? Should we focus more on the trades? Should we do more pre-arrival work? Employers, should we be working with employers in anticipation of the expression of interest system? Should we help identify those employers who are now big users of temporary foreign workers and find out why are they going that route, rather than looking at people already here? How can we help them? How can we match them? How can we assist to make the people here as attractive as bringing in temporary foreign workers? And the programs, should we actively engage to ensure that new programs are designed and funds allocated to address immigrant-specific needs? So 4 possible areas for collaborative discussion and opportunities. So in conclusion, huge changes are in play. The implementation details will be key. The devil is in the details, and we don't have a lot of the details yet. Monitoring and evaluation will be absolutely necessary, and you guys are on the ground. Your staff see folks coming in every day. They know, they're the early warning system. They know who's getting service, who's not, and what kind of services people need. There is much less of a distinction than there used to be between the domestic worker and the immigrant worker, the international student, temporary entrance, permanent entrance. They're all part of this pool now. And to arbitrarily say, we're only serving these but not these, doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of these changes in immigration policy or labor market policy. And the bottom line is, how can your organizations get ahead of the curve and ensure that your voice is heard as new policies and programs are designed, and to ensure that services continue to adapt to changing immigration and labor market policies and programs? Thank you.